Hello, and welcome to the Social Psychic Radio Show featuring Jason Zook. In uncertain times, we must change our focus and priorities. This show will highlight social justice issues with the goal of expanding minds and increasing unity, love, and mutual respect for ourselves and our planet. We support the Black Lives Matter movement. Our show aspires to promote social spirituality, which simply means that by coming together, we can solve any of our problems, including the goal of bringing an end to all forms of hate, discrimination, bias, or oppression. We must protect our environment, reform our criminal justice system, and protect every citizen from police brutality. When we come together, it becomes possible to bridge the gaps that plague our society and divide us from within. We the people means everyone.
Hello and welcome to the Social Psychic Radio Show. This is Jason Zook. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to welcome special guest Christian de la Huerta to the show today. With 30 years of experience, Christian is sought after as a spiritual teacher, a personal transformation coach, and the leading voice in the breathwork community. Christian has traveled the world offering inspiring and transformational retreats, combining psychological and spiritual teachings with lasting and life-changing effects. An award-winning, critically acclaimed author, he has spoken at numerous universities and conferences and on the TEDx stage. His new book, Awakening the Soul of Power, was described by multiple Grammy award-winning singer Gloria Estefan as a balm for the soul of anyone searching for truth and answers to life's difficult questions. More information about his work may be found at www.soulpower.com. It's a great pleasure that I welcome Christian to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Jason. I'm happy to be here with you.
Welcome to the show. It's just a pleasure to have you here. I'm all about mindfulness, and I know you're a spiritual person too. And I just find having this kind of a conversation at the end of my work week is a refreshing thing. And I know our audience is going to enjoy this very much. I want to get into a couple of things. First, I want to ask you, how did you get Gloria Estefan to write forward or, some praise for your book? Because I'm a big fan. Going back to the Miami Sound Machine when I was a little kid.
Well, it has to do with that, actually. It's a testament to perseverance. Like if you believe in something, stick with it and follow it through. I basically courted her for 3 years to get that endorsement. And, I read that she was going to be honored at some kind of nonprofit gala down here in Miami. And so I bought a ticket and I went. And at the end of it, I made a beeline just to make sure that I spoke with her before she left. And she was really friendly, really accessible. It's like she spoke to anybody who was there waiting for her. And so that's how I connected with her. Before Gloria was Gloria, when it was Miami Sound Machine, they used to play at our high school dances. And so we laughed about that. And then I told her a little bit about the book, and she gave me her manager's card. And that's what took 2 years, right? He was doing his job, being the guard dog, the guardian. And, I almost gave up a couple of times. And one time I had this shift in thinking, and I thought, all right, well, she probably is bombarded with requests like this. What's going to touch her heart? What's in it for her, in a sense? And so I thought about this book is a part of a series on heroism, what it means to live a heroic life in the 21st century. So I rewrote my entire approach and wrote her a completely different email. And I said, look, I know you probably don't think of yourself as this because I can see that you're a humble person, but the way that you recovered from your bus accident has been an inspiration to millions and millions of people all over the world. And it was nothing short of heroic. And then I'd done some research and found out her father had been a counter-revolutionary. So in other words, he fought against the Castro regime, and as did my parents, from Cuba. He was here. And so I said, the sacrifices your parents and your dad made and my parents made are, again, nothing short of heroic. Then I also read that she'd helped a lot of Latino artists, make it as in that world. So I spoke about her generosity, all of it true, all of it authentic. It was just a matter of reframing it. And then I asked her, would you help this fellow Cuban American reach a broader audience with this powerful and empowering message? And so I waited another 3 months and I was about to give up again. And just this little voice in me just said, just one more email. I said, all right, one more email. And I said to him, look, I'm not stalking you. I just want to make sure you're getting my emails. And this time he wrote right back and he said, she's about halfway through. She's loving the book. And can you give us another week? And of course, I would have given them another 3 months. But that's the story of that. So again, like, persevere.
What's that like, knowing your book's being reviewed by Gloria Estefan and you're waiting for the response to see if she'll like stamp her approval on it or not? Were you nervous, or what were you thinking?
It was, it's like kind of like that disbelief and exciting. Because like you, I'm such a fan of her as a human being. She's such an incredible person. I love her music too. And the fact that she is Cuban American as I am, it's just another layer of delight.
I love that. What a great story. I appreciate you sharing that with us. I was looking at your book, Awakening to Soul Power, How to Live Heroically and Set Yourself Free. And I know this is the first of 3 books in a series. And my first question when I was looking at this book is, what does it mean to you to be a hero in our modern time, 2020, 2021?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I think, by the way, that's one of the ways in which COVID, without minimizing the tragic parts of it, one of the ways in which it has served is it's helped us to expand what that word means. I think for most of us before COVID, when we thought of heroes, we thought of a superhero with a cape, or maybe a warrior, or first responder, or firefighter, somebody like that, somebody who places their life at risk for the sake of somebody else, or a bigger, larger cause. Now we include our medical professionals, our doctors, our nurses, our respiratory therapists. And I think we even include like grocery store clerks and delivery people who literally place their lives at risk and made a lot of sacrifices to keep the rest of us fed and provided for. And so the book asks the question, what about the rest of us, right? And to kind of coast through life unconsciously and just kind of be buffeted by and impacted by other people's demands and expectations and judgments, and unquestioning why we believe the things we believe and why we do the things we do. Anybody can do that. To take the time and the effort to go inside and to face our inner demons, to transcend and overcome our own fears, our own obstacles that we have allowed ourselves to be held back by, to understand the patterns of why we do the things we do, to get really honest and realize that there is one common denominator in every single one of our relationships. So if we want to understand why we get into these patterns of relationships that are often self-sabotaging, to be willing to ask all those questions, it's nothing short of heroic.
You mentioned the term spiritual awakening in your first chapter, and I wanted to ask you, when did you have your first spiritual awakening in your life, and what impact did it have on you writing this book, or the series, I should say?
I think there've been, several layers of that. I know that a really big one was when I first did breath work a little bit over 30 years ago. And I was on a track to get a PhD in psychology. My dad was a psychiatrist, so I come out of that psychotherapy tradition. When I discovered breath work, I jumped tracks. Like one session, after my first session, I knew that I'd never be the same. And I knew that I had to do it again. And I knew that I had to make it available to others. And I jumped tracks. Now I offer it all over the world. Never went for the formal PhD track. And I think part of what it did, it was that combined with understanding what the ego mind is. And I took this weekend intensive with a teacher that I reference in the book, in which, and that weekend I both did breathwork for the first time and understood what the ego mind is. And the combination was so powerful that it just forever changed my life. And in terms of the power part of it, right, that I'm an unlikely person to be writing about heroism and personal empowerment, because my first 10 years of life were in a communist regime. And for anybody who doesn't know what that means, the discussion about personal power is kind of ludicrous in a totalitarian dictatorial regime in which the government, the state, pretty much owns you and tells you what to do and what you can and cannot do. And my family was also very, very Catholic. And so that's another very hierarchical power structure in which, power is from top down, and you're told what to believe, what not to believe, what's right, what's wrong. And with all due respect, to any tradition. So when I came to the States, I can't tell you how painfully shy I was. And part of the reason was that because my parents were counter-revolutionaries and they were conspiring against Castro and kind of cahoots with the CIA, we were kind of raised with this implicit message. It's like they didn't really tell us what was going on. We didn't really know what was going on, but the implicit message was not to be seen too much, right? To kind of blend and not shine too much. At the same time that we all had this drive to excel and to be good students and all that. I was okay one-on-one, but if you added a third human being, I clammed up. And when we came to the States, that even got worse because, of course, not speaking a word of English. But I was a good student. One of the blessings to me, one of the gifts of having been raised in Cuba is we had a TV, but there was nothing worth watching. So we grew up reading and we grew up playing outside and creating our own games, inventing our own pastimes. And I'm so grateful for that. And because I had such a relationship with words and with reading, I did well in high school. I had all A's except for one B. And I didn't set out to do this intentionally, but looking back on it, I know that subconsciously I sabotaged my grade point average because back then there is no possible way that I could have gotten up in front of an auditorium filled with hundreds and hundreds of people and delivered the valedictorian speech. There's just no way. I wasn't up for that. And the reason that I share that story is because these days, as you were talking about in the intro, it's like I speak all over the world. I've spoken at dozens of universities, conferences, bookstores, churches, and the TEDx stage, so that I know when I say that we can transcend and overcome whatever our fears were, whatever our past traumas were, that I do that from experience. It's like my adolescence was one long depression with suicidal fantasies. And these days, like no matter the details of my life, whether a relationship works out or it doesn't, a project succeeds or it fails, in quotes, no matter the circumstances, I never question my self-worth. Like that is established. It's like, I know who I am. And so that I know that, the people who follow the teachings and the path that I guide them through in this book, they can get there as well.
Interesting. Looking at your book, I haven't had a book to review, which is one of 3 in a series. And I wanted to ask you, have you already gotten the concepts for the other? I know you have the title here. Book 2 is going to be Attracting and Nurturing Relationships at Work. And book 3 is going to be Living Your True Purpose and Leading with Soul. Have you already started to work on those other 2 books already? Or how has that worked into your debut of this book? Because normally when people release a book, they'll do one at a time and not allude to the others. So I kind of like the fact that you're already telling your audience, hey, if you like this and Gloria liked it, there's 2 more coming.
Yeah. What happened was that it was all going to be one book and it was getting too long. And so I thought, we live in an ADD society with a very limited attention span. So I decided to split the book into 3. So I'm halfway done through the second book on relationships. It also mirrors the themes of the retreats that I've been doing for 30 years. So a lot of the content's in my head, or I've been developing it. It's just that I got to get out of my head and onto page. And yeah, the next one, I think it'll come out I'm shooting for the spring of 2022.
Excellent.
Around Valentine's Day.
I feel like it's a roadmap in certain ways. Would you say that? The way you're writing it? Because through this one, Awakening the Soul of Power, I felt like you break it down in such a way that's very relatable. Obviously, I know spiritual concepts because I do read spiritual stuff quite like you do probably, or just live in it. You're in it all the time. But for a layperson who doesn't really delve in spirituality, I love the way that you present your ideas. And I like the way that you share concepts and with the ego and the interplay between conquering your ego and having a soulful purpose. I want to ask you, going in your background, I know you mentioned that you lived in Cuba during Castro's regime and that you escaped. One of the things you alluded to when you went to Georgia, I believe, after you relocated to the United States, your sexuality had something in your early history that we haven't brought up yet. And I wanted to ask you, how did you deal with being gay in America in the 19 whatevers? And what steps did you take to overcome those challenges? Because I know that's a very tough road sometimes.
Yeah, and it's a great question. I got to tell you, Jason, that's in the book, as you know. Out of dozens and dozens of podcast interviews, you're the only one so far who has actually picked up on that and had the courage, I guess, to ask me about it. And I don't know why they haven't. Like maybe they're intimidated by the question. I don't know. Well, that's the reason that my adolescence was so difficult, because I knew from a young age that I was gay, and at the same time that I was really Catholic, and and that there was a part of me that wanted to serve the sacred, to serve God as I understood it then. And in those days, I translated that desire, wanting to become a priest, which I know it was a legitimate vocation, like a legitimate desire to serve and to make a difference. And looking back on it, I think there was also subconsciously in those days, I naively believed that priests were celibate. And so in my mind, it was a way that I could sublimate my sexuality, that I didn't have to deal with it. So I can't tell you how difficult that was. It was like trying to reconcile my sexuality and my spirituality in a religion that told me that I was going to burn in hell for eternity. Difficult years.
It's like Happy Pride Month. You're going to burn in eternity.
Yeah.
I just like to lighten the mood a little with that.
That's hilarious.
It's a strong message. You have to recover it yourself.
And at one time I remember I was young. I must have been younger than 10. No, I must have been like 10 or 11. And I asked this priest, well, how long is eternity? Exactly, because I don't know what you know about the Catholic religion, but they have kind of this hierarchy of sins. They have the menial sins, which you're lying, you're stealing, that kind of thing. That's not such a big deal. But then you have this other category of mortal sins, which means that if you've committed a mortal sin and you haven't received absolution through a priest, this can't be done directly. It has to be given to you through a priest. You go to hell for eternity. And to put things in context, technically, masturbation is still considered a mortal sin. Most priests don't enforce that or don't scare people with that. But not to mention the unmentionable sin that I was really worried about. So he told me, which is such an interesting thing, I guess coming from an island environment, he goes, well, imagine you're going to go to the beach with a thimble and you start taking out of the ocean with a thimble. That's eternity, which of course terrified me. Worried about the unmentionable sin that I was really worried about. It went through what got me out of that depression was a combination of three things. When I was probably 18, I fell in love for the first time and experienced for the first time having sex and making love. And around the same time, I went through a phase of experimentation with mind-expanding substances, which began a process of questioning reality and the societal norms and what to believe and all that kind of stuff. And then I took a class in existentialism in college, in my first year of college, and which again began to deepen that process of questioning and questioning the Catholic worldview and why I believed the things I believed. And really difficult time to dismantle a whole system of beliefs and a worldview. But it was so worth it, because once, sort of like the Phoenix Rising, like you take everything down and then you get to build it up and you get to decide for yourself, who you are and what you're here for and what you believe and what works for you and what doesn't work for you. So I know most of us end up going through that process, but I think that is one of the gifts of being gay in a society that still, and not so much anymore, but still, certainly when I was coming out, it was so wrong and so bad and so sinful that it forced you, to go through that process. It sent me into an existential crisis at a very young age. But I'm glad for that, because I kind of got a head start.
Well, I'm sure it gives you a deep layer of empathy where you can empathize with anyone in our society who deals with any type of adversity or ridicule or isolation, which I think is powerful in your role, coach, and as an expert on heroism. I think you're very humble in your book, and I give you credit for that. But you say in one of your chapters, I think it's chapter 3, you mentioned, what does a gay man have to say about empowering women? And you know what I say to that? Everything. Because there's similarities. I'm not trying to be societal here or anything with sociology. I'm not any of that. But when you look at the similarities of what women are going through, and when you look at empowering them in our society, in this male-dominated society, as you say, structure roles are authoritarian top-down. Well, in America, we have the similar structure here. We have a top-down approach. There's something called the glass ceiling for women.
Yeah.
It's a similar thing. It's not Cuba. We didn't have Castro here, but we have our own issues that we have to go up against. And I think your book has a lot to say about empowering women. And I like that. I love the message of empowerment for our audience and for our society, because I think we need as much of that as possible in our post-COVID era that we're living in right now.
Yeah. Thank you for picking up on that. I also think it was kind of ballsy, and I love it, to write a book as a gay man about what it means to be a man in the 21st century. And you're right. The book has it's for everybody, but it has that particular focus on women's empowerment stemming from my conviction. When I think about it strategically, like, what is one thing that we could do, that we could focus on, that's going to then impact a bunch of other issues that we're facing? And it's not to idealize women. It's not to put women up on a pedestal. It's not to give women more crap that they have to do and more of a mess to clean up. It's because as a species, as a planet, we've been working so off balance where it comes to the balance between the masculine and the feminine energies. And so I believe that when women are in 50% of power in this world, we're going to have a very different relationship to war and poverty.
I agree.
And how we treat the environment and social justice and wealth distribution, and to all of it. And what is interesting is that this more patriarchal system of power over, the kind of power that requires that we push somebody down, that we step on them, that we put our knee to their neck, power that is based on force, on fear, on control, on domination, that system of toxic masculinity, for lack of another word, it doesn't work for anybody, including men. And so let's look at a couple of numbers that are really interesting to look at. Longevity. Women in the US outlive men by 5 years. We look at those numbers globally, it's 7 years. Suicide. Men commit suicide in this country 4 times as frequently as women. 70% of the suicides in the US are committed by middle-aged white men who are still the group that holds most of the power in this world. So what's up with that? Why is that? How could that be? What's not working? And I think part of the reason for that is because we've got this twisted definition about what it means to be a man, and that somebody along the way decided that the emotions were weakness. It's like, wait a minute, the emotions are not weak, they're not strength, they're not good, they're not bad. Emotions are energy, just like everything else. What used to be spiritual teaching that everything is energy, now we know from quantum physics that it's true. That means the body's energy, it's vibration, so are the emotions. And so because we suppress our emotions, we all do, but in particular men, who ever since we were little boys were told little boys don't cry, because guess what? Then only little girls, and that's the last thing you want to be. And it's kind of messed up and it's kind of sad, because what happens as a result is we walk around like these unfeeling, uncaring robots, which has an impact on our relationships. Who wants to be in a relationship with an uncaring robot? And then we limit so much of the human experience because of this misunderstanding and misinterpretations of what it means to be a man. So that's why I spent a whole chapter on that too, and looked at some of the traditional male roles, like the provider, the conqueror, the explorer, and kind of upgraded them for the 21st century.
I was looking at your book, and you mentioned that you have an Unleash Your Inner Hero Facebook group. Yeah. I want to see if you could share that a little with our audience, in case, I don't know if it's only for people who are in your book or if it's for anybody, but I always I'd like to have you explain that a little bit to our audience and what it's about.
Yeah, it's creating a community, a supportive community of people who are into the kind of stuff you and I are talking about. People who want to explore the inner world, right? That's one of the ways in which I talk about and redefine the explorer. It's like, what if we explored the inner world and the vast universe inside each one of us that remains tragically, for the most part, unexplored. And that is where all the answers to all our questions and all our problems and the solutions to all our issues are in there. So what if we explored that? And so it's also for people who have had it with this kind of hierarchical power over structure, and who are interested in exploring issues like, well, how do we do power with instead of power over? Because that's one of the first that we get into in the book, is that there's different kinds of power, and that the reason many of us have an ambivalent, conflicted relationship to power. It's like we want it, but we're afraid of it, is that we've been conditioned to believe that power is a bad thing. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts, absolutely. And so then what good-hearted person wants to be corrupted? What they forgot to tell us is that that quote by Lord Acton was speaking specifically about political power, not personal power. And so combine that with the fact that every day we turn on the news and we witness at least one abuse of power. And so again, what good-hearted person wants to be abusive, wants to abuse power. And then combine that with what we were just talking about the emotions, that we hate conflict, we avoid confrontation, we run away from our feelings. And what happens when you put all that into a mix is that we end up giving our power away. We end up saying yes when inside we really feel no. We end up playing small. We end up settling for less. And the sad part is that we do all of this for an illusion of security, for a false sense of acceptance, and for morsels, crumbs of pseudo-love. And so it's not an effective strategy. And it's about time that we create a relationship both to power, so that there is a way that we can step into power that is a match with who we are, with the innate goodness in our hearts.
I love that. Very well said. I'll ask you this. Your book talks about the theme of heroism. I was looking at your book and I'm like, what does heroism mean to you? And who is your personal hero that you feel inspired you the most on your journey so far?
God, that's a great question. The one that pops into mind right now is my mom and both my parents, but my dad's been gone 20 years. My mom is now in that process of fading. And, when I think about the fact that they had 9 kids, when we left Cuba, my mom was 8 months pregnant. My oldest sister was 12 and I was 10. So all 9 kids. The last kid was born in Spain. They didn't speak a word of English, when we came to the States. And the heroism that, the number and the depth of sacrifices that they made for their kids to feed us and to put us all through private schools and to dress us, it just boggles my mind. It just boggles my mind.
So your mom was your personal hero. That sounds powerful, because it sounds like she did a heck of a lot to help you guys acclimate to the United States after fleeing Cuba. I feel like you could write a book about your family background in greater detail, and that would be very entertaining and insightful book as well for the masses. Based on your story, I mean, not many people have personal historical stories that coincide with our modern history. And so you fleeing Castro's regime, it resonates with me. I feel like that's very powerful. And it's timely, because you're still struggling with that in Cuba today. Even though Castros are gone, that the communism's not gone, and the totalitarian is, none of that's gone. It's still there. So you're still fighting that same battle so many years later. And I guess for you as a Cuban American, what do you think about the future of the country over there, your home roots, with the way things have been and what you know now at this stage of your life? What do you think about going back to Cuba, or your reflection on your childhood there?
Like I said before, I'm really grateful for the experience. And I did go back. I went back maybe, 10 years ago, which was a really, really powerful experience. And in spite of the lack of everything that there is over there, the lack of freedom and the lack of just physical stuff and goods and food, one thing that really impacted me is that the people haven't lost the joie de vivre, the joy of life. So you hear music and you hear laughter, and that there is this creativity that's why you see these cars from the 50s that they still have running somehow. And so I really respected that and honor that. I don't know what's going to happen. It's like Raul just retired. I think it was last year or the year before. It's still totalitarian. There still hasn't been enough of an opening. That's slowly happening. People now have access to the internet, which I imagine that's going to have a really powerful effect in terms of information and access to information. But then again, like you have China, where I've taught many times too, and the government still has the ability to control the access that you have and what portals you're able to access. So it's really interesting. Yeah, I'm really grateful for all that perspective, because so many things that we take for granted here, it's, it's let me give you this example, just like such a simple thing. What is chewing gum to us here in the States? Like, we stick a piece of gum in our mouth, we spit it out, we don't even think about it.
Mm-hmm.
When we were kids, and we had it better than most because my parents had friends who worked in foreign embassies. So a couple of times a year, we used to get a pack of chiclets, and divide the chiclets between all the kids. And what we do is at the end of the day, we get a glass of water, with a little bit of water in the bottom. We put our gum in there, put toothpaste, and stir it up so it'd be minty the next day, and then hide it for like 2 weeks at a time until my mom found it and threw it out eventually. And that's just like a simple thing, like chewing gum. The real big things that we take for granted here is like the liberties, the rights, the things that we take for granted here, like to decide to go to college or what you're going to study. Like those are things that not everybody has around the world.
Freedom of choice.
Freedom of choice.
Individuality.
Oh my God, it's like just that. There's just no words. That's priceless. And from my perspective, with this country, which I so deeply love and appreciate, and I don't think that one can really appreciate what America means unless you come from a place where you didn't have those freedoms and those rights. And so it's scary to me to see how closely we have come and skirted and are flirting with democracy.
Terrifying to me. Last year, and seeing what our country is dealing with and grappling with, I became a lawyer because of my love of the Constitution and our type of government and all our rights and everything else. And last year, you mentioned social justice. Last year, when George Floyd was murdered, I went and protested peacefully each time, 5 times. And it really instilled in me that, our society we take for granted so many things, but I mean, the democracy that we enjoy and the rights that we enjoy are fluid. They're not written in stone, and it's not like they can't be changed with a dictatorial regime of our own. Or an abuse of power on our own. And, it's terrifying to me to think about that. And when I was looking at your book and you were talking about the power dynamics and how we can look at power from different perspectives, one of the questions I had when I was looking at your book is you talk about heroes and connecting with power and authority and those kind of things. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, well, how do you think a hero can relate to power in a way that's different than hierarchy, fear, force, or abuse? Like, what do we need to do to change the way we consider power in our lives and in our government and in our society?
Yeah, great question, Jason. And by the way, I love that as an attorney that you balance the legal with the spiritual. You're only I only know one other person who does that. Friend who's a lawyer and teaches yoga. It's his real passion. He's a yoga teacher. And it's interesting, given your inspiration last year, that today is the Chauvin got sentenced. Yeah. Interesting timing with that. I think the main thing, and what I get into fairly quickly in the book, is realizing that there are different kinds of power. So there are worldly power, the way that the world relates to power, or the ego relates to power, which, for example, we tend to associate with money, or fame, or people who are high up in some kind of hierarchy, whether it's a corporate ladder or some kind of religious institution or whatever it is. But the thing about all those kinds of expressions of power is that because they're external, because they're outside of us, they're fickle. They're here today, gone tomorrow. Whereas the other kind of power that I'm calling spiritual power or soulful power, it's inside each one of us. It's inherent. It's innate to each one of us. Nobody can give it to us. Nobody can take it away. We are the only ones who can give it away. And like we were talking about before, give it away for some lame reasons that are not very effective. Worldly power always has an agenda. So it's very self-serving. It's always trying to get something for itself. And it's self-aggrandizing. So it's always kind of blowing itself up to seem bigger than it is. Whereas the other kind of power, spiritual power, inner power, authentic power, is humble. It doesn't need to prove anything to anybody. And it's about service. It's about making a difference. And so I think of, for example, a Gandhi or a Gandalf from Lord of the Rings, in their simple monastic robes, their sandal feet. You would never know from looking at them how much power they hold until it's called for. And then watch out. Like
Mhm.
Gandhi brought the British Empire to its knees when it was at its zenith, at its highest point, without ever shooting a gun or landing a single punch. Talk about power.
That's true. And you know what? I respect Gandhi tremendously for his ability to lead in ways just by example in his life. And true leaders don't have to call themselves leaders. They lead by example, or they lead from within, and they help guide. And it's like you with your book. You're sharing a message because you have the passion for it, you have the vision for it, and you make it happen. But you don't probably view yourself as a leader per se, even though you are in your own right as an author and as a spiritual person and as a visionary. And so our society has tons of unsung heroes, tons of people in our lives who have such purpose and value. And when we're impacted in such a positive way by the heroes that we, like your mother, my mother, whoever it is,
Yeah.
and acts of kindness and things that we can do in each other's orbit, I feel like that is something that we can look at as hope for our futures and helping us get past a lot of our problems that we're being plagued with right now.
Yeah. And Jason, that's so true. And what gives me hope is, I know the 100th monkey effect, was kind of demythified, like the story that it was based on. Turns out that it wasn't quite that way. But I'm still banking on this kind of critical mass concept. Like enough of us get it, enough of us wake up, then hopefully it'll be like a mass thing that happens. And in the meantime, when I think about the situation that we find ourselves in, and this hole that we have collectively dug ourselves into, when I think about how do we get out of this, the only thing that comes to mind is paraphrasing Einstein, who said that you can't solve a problem from the same level of consciousness in which it was created. So the only thing that I see is going to pop us out of this hole is nothing short of a revolution in consciousness, a leap, like a spiritual revolution, a leap in consciousness. And that's why I think that it's all hands on deck. And that's the message of this book, that anybody who's listening to this or watching this who has the slightest suspicion that they have work to do, as teachers, as healers, as activists and promoters of change, it's like, this is it. This is the time that we've been waiting for. And I'm sorry, but we don't have the time to wait another 5 years to get another degree, another certification. Get those things if you want to, but don't use that as an excuse to not step into your role. All hands on deck.
It's like roll up your sleeves.
Exactly.
Right? Roll up your sleeves and get ready. I'm looking at it, and this is an interesting synchronistic point that I'm looking at. I'm all about synchronicity, by the way. Angel numbers, times of day, all that.
Yeah,
I get that. That's why I brought it up. I feel like you as well. I'm looking at, the way we were just talking about the different forms of power, and you mentioned soul power, and there's a whole egoistic power, ego power. And I wanted to say, could you say that certain people that are governed by ego power are the ones that are like pretty ruthless and authoritarian, or the ones that may not be the ones that are compassionate and reflective and respectful of others?
Yeah. And yeah, the way that I think so, the way that I would frame it, it's that it's based on fear. So in times of dramatic change, like we're living, like dramatic social changes, like dramatic economic, intellectual, information change, like everything's, the environment's changing, everything's changing in front of our eyes. And one thing that we can say that we're actually witnessing is the end of the patriarchy. And so in times of dramatic change, there's a certain number of people that are going to be more fear-based and who are going to go back, right? They're going to go look back towards this idealized past that doesn't even exist. No. It's like, let's go back to the way that it was in the 50s or the 60s or whatever, however far they're looking back. But that doesn't even exist.
Not reality.
It's not a reality. And it's living in denial. And I think, that a lot of men are doing that, because as women are getting more empowered and as women are rightfully, claiming their own, equity and justice and equal pay. And it's amazing that it hasn't even, it's about 100 years now since the women got first right to vote. And that minorities are stepping up and demanding equal treatment and equal justice and all that the main repository of power, which were white men, like to me, in disproportionate numbers, they're looking back and trying to hold on to the way things used to be. And I actually have compassion for that, because, for somebody whose identity was to be the provider, right? I think it's like, I forget the numbers now, it's in the book. It said that 30-40% of the households, of the heterosexual households in this country, the women are beginning to out-earn their men. I think it's approaching 40%. And 50% of college graduates today are women. So things are changing in front of our eyes.
I hear that.
and for men, whose sole identity was that, it's like suddenly it's like, well, who am I if I'm not in my job? As a lot of these jobs are being replaced, outsourced and gone overseas and replaced by machines and computers. So that's, I really have, my heart goes out to them, because they're going through a dramatic identity crisis. And one way to go is you look towards the back and try to reclaim a past that is impossible to reclaim. It's
on the wrong side of history.
It's not going to happen.
Wow.
In the wrong side of conscious evolution. You can't put that cat back in the bag. And so, but that's why I added that chapter and look at some of the traditional male roles and kind of provide suggestions as to ways that we can assume them today. It's like, wait a minute, who says that being a provider is only about bringing a paycheck? It's like, wait a minute, what a limited way of looking at yourself and looking at who you are as a man. What about providing a safe container for your family to grow and to thrive and to be all that they can be, to really fulfill their potential? What about being a rock for your family, so that people get to stand on that rock and explore who they are? It's like, man, that's a much deeper way of looking at the provider role.
Well, and it's also this idea: if things aren't the way they were in the past and things are changing in society, one of the things you can do is change your paradigm. They don't have to be victims. I'm talking about white males who feel threatened by the advent of women becoming what they should have been all along in our society, right? And you and I sound like we come from families where there's strong matriarchal women figures in our lives. I came from a single parent female mother, and grandmother who were strong in my life. So I respect women in authority. I was never threatened by women. Right. I don't hold on to that at all. And so anyone who feels threatened, like we're discussing, it's like, put your big boy pants on, right? And learn how to have empathy, understanding, emotional support. Why don't you play some of the roles that your wife or your partner or whoever it is in your life gave you that? And I know you can attribute that to feminine roles, but it's not really. It's about being balanced. Exactly. That's how I look at it. And it's like, switch your hat. If you think you're being stuck in your career and you're not happy because you're being paid, you have threats to your career by whatever, other people or whoever it is, fine, innovate. I mean, why can't we innovate? You innovated by going from Cuba to Georgia to being an author and a spiritual leader. I've innovated. Why can't other people innovate? I don't understand that.
Yeah, and we get to reinvent ourselves. We get to reboot and decide who we are and change course midstream if we want to. It's like, and I love that you already went for the jugular and used the word victimization, because that, to me, that is the single most difficult thing on this heroic journey. Most of us have this victim relationship to life and to others. And if we want to have personal power, if we want to reclaim our power, as long as we're holding anybody outside of us or anything outside of us responsible for our state of being, for our condition, we just give our power away. So whether it's mom who did this or dad who didn't do that, or the teacher or the minister or the system, racism or homophobia or sexism, not to deny any of those things that they're real and they actually have an impact. But as long as we're holding anything outside of us responsible for our state of being, we just give our power away, and tragically often to the perpetrator. And that is so hard for people to get.
You're right. We are living in pivotal times. We are living in what I call, like, we're just shredding all old norms, right, to society. One of the things I want to bring up to you is we were talking about LGBT stuff. How about the fact that Karl Klug came out recently as the first NFL player to be gay, and how that took precedence this week in the local news cycle? I was asking about your opinion on that. I consider Karl a hero. in our classic sense of the word, doing something that takes courage and takes some strength. And how do you see that in the reference of your own concepts that we're discussing today about taking bold acts and standing out of your comfort zone and having that courage to put yourself out there and try to change things for everyone else?
Yeah, and it's huge. Like what he did is huge. To be the first active NFL player to come out, that is huge. And I read a meme today, which was interesting, which said that, because if we go back to Stonewall, I wasn't there, but the stories that I've read, that it was the more feminine men and drag queens who were at the head of that, people who couldn't hide, like maybe I could, or maybe this football player did, and so many other, like, we know he's not the only one. And so I wanted to also honor, like, without taking anything away from him, I also wanted to know those who went before and who couldn't hide their sexual orientation, because they made it possible, right? Like people like, I don't know, so many people, and even people like Ellen, who did it early on and also took so many risks professionally. And so yeah, I mean, I really honor it. I'm very grateful that he did. And it's a long tradition, because it's part of what we need to do. It's in going back to that conversation of balancing the masculine and the feminine, because as a culture, we have turned the feminine into something weak. Because the important thing is that we have turned the feminine into weakness. And, who said, like, if you want to talk power, let's talk about the power of creation that resides in the female body. Like, that's power. And I'm not going to do it justice, but the way that it's paraphrasing Betty White, there's no way I'm going to tell this story like she would. But apparently they were having a conversation about, she was being interviewed about something, and somebody said something about having balls, or having, comparing it to courage. And she goes, wait a minute, I don't even know how we started that connection between having balls and courage, because you thump those little things and the guy collapses, bends over in pain. You want to talk courage? You want to talk strength? Let's talk vaginas. Those things take a pounding.
I think one of the things I wanted to ask you before we got disrupted by the weather was, every hero has a villain. And looking at the villains of our modern era, what do you consider the archetype of a villain in 2021 in our society here in the United States, based on your viewpoints of calling all heroes, awakening the soul of power? Like, how do you see heroes, as we've discussed this in our concepts today? What do you see about villains? Like, how do you see us taking on the villains in our society? Do you identify the archetype of what our modern villain is? And what do you think we need to do in order to overcome anything that villains try to keep the power, hold us down, that kind of thing?
It would be really easy for me to point the finger and signal other people out. I think it's more valuable to realize that the villain is within, inside each one of us. And that's the ego mind.
Ego.
And we all have an ego. And so it's the level of consciousness in which humanity is stuck. And that's why I spent the first quarter of the book talking about what the ego is, because if we want to have the kind of relationships that we really long for, if we want to have a sense of personal empowerment, if we want to have a life that is filled with meaning and with purpose, we've got to understand what the ego is. And we don't have the time to get into it now, but that is the villain. That is the source of all our suffering.
Great answer.
And yeah, there are people in the world that embody that and express that more than others. But I think rather than adding to the polarization that we're all experiencing, I think it's more valuable to say, hey, you know what, let's all look within.
I love that. Actually, tying into my one of my final questions with you is, how do we heal our ego? Right? Because we all have one and we all have challenges to it. So how do we heal it?
It's a huge question too. And it's a process, right? I'm in the middle of a year-long virtual coaching program that I, thank you, COVID, because after 30 years of doing, live retreats, COVID forced my hand and I had to create virtual coaching program. But what I'm loving about it is that I get to spread out the teachings over the course of a year and deliver it piecemeal, right? With because people I've noticed over the years will come to a weekend retreat and have this amazing experience, life-changing. And if they don't have a support system and a practice, their own practice and reminders when they go back home, it's really easy to get sucked back into the day-to-day and into the distractions of life, which are many. And then they have to, then they forget, and those voices of the ego of self-doubt and fear, lack of self-worth and all that stuff starts dragging them down again. This concept, it's allowing me to spread them out and to deliver it piecemeal, and to, here's the key differences. Interactivity. So just in the way that the book is designed, every week they get a little bit of content, and the difference is that they have practices that are designed to apply the teachings to our lives, because we don't need more information. We've got information overload. What we need is transformation. And so that's what those practices are designed to do, to ensure that the teachings don't stay at just a hypothetical, oh, what a great idea. It's like we want to apply them to their lives. And just like last night, we finished the second quarter, and it was so humbling and so beautiful to see how well people are doing already in that very issue that you're asking of understanding. So that's the first step, is understanding what the ego is, because there's so much confusion about it. So it's like understanding. That's part of that question of why we do the things we do, and why we limit ourselves, and why we allow ourselves to be held back by fear. It's all connected to the ego. Why we react and then regret, saying or something we said or did. Like, so it's really, really important. There's no way around that if we want to be free ultimately. And then it's self-observation. Like, even with my own story, like it's evident that so much of what we do is subconscious, that we're driven by all these traumas that we never healed, and and all these lifetime of suppressed emotions that, now we know they're just there under the surface in the tissues of our body, impacting and affecting our relationships and the quality of our lives. So Carl Jung, said that part of the process of enlightenment is making the subconscious conscious, so that we can bring choice back into the equation. So a big part of the answer to your question is understanding what we do, and then observing ourselves, so that we begin to see the patterns. Like, do we tend, what are our triggers? What kind of people and situations get us and trigger us? Understanding what projection is, so that we can reel back those projections, because it's a pretty safe bet. If it's there, it's here. And the more whatever they do gets us upset, the clearer that it's over here too, in some way, in some different subtle way that's going to look different, but we're doing the same thing, probably in relationship to ourselves. And let me just take that to the max, like terrorism, right? Like, nobody listened to this. It's about to wrap their bodies up in explosives and walk into a crowded mall and detonate themselves, right? We're not there. But so it's really easy to otherize that and to make them the other. It's like, oh my God, I would never do that. The ego is very good about that, about separating and making itself superior or inferior. But let me ask us this, have we ever terrorized somebody else emotionally? Have we ever terrorized ourselves? And the answer is, of course. The number that we do to ourselves, that ego is the inner judge, that harsh inner judge. The things that we say to ourselves in our heads, we would never, ever say to anybody else. So that there is an inner terrorist inside each one of us too. And so that, understanding those patterns and why we do the things we do, it's only possible by self-awareness. So rather than going through life numbing out, running away from our problems and from ourselves, refusing to face our inner demons, anybody can do. Reacting, anybody can do. Pausing and having the clarity and the presence to in the moment say, ouch, that one stung. And rather than just going into that automatic ego reaction and stinging them back or punching them back against the wall, it's like, wait a minute, that one hurt. How do I want to be in response to this, right? Just choice, rather than being driven by these egoic, they do this, I do that, and then until one of us blows up. And so understanding self-awareness, and then the breath, right? Developing a relationship with your breath, because that's what allows us to bring choice back into the equation rather than just reacting. If we have the presence to slow the breath down, then that buys us some time, quiets down the heart, If we quiet down the heart, then the nervous system also relaxes. And it all begins from slowing down the breath.
I do breath work in my practice as a psychic. I meditate a lot I take 3 deep breaths before any reading I ever give. And I find it grounds me. And then when I meditate, I've meditated more in the last 365 days than I ever did for 45 years. I love meditation. It's my personal journey inward. Everything you're describing, I connect with, I understand. And can you imagine if our society adopted even half of the principles we're talking about spiritually? I mean, I give the analogy that when you're stuck in a traffic jam or an accident, right? And you're sitting there and you can't move at all. Well, if you meditate while you're driving in a traffic jam or pray or whatever you decide to do spiritually, you'll find that that is not going to be as much of a burden. It's like, use your time wisely. If you're stuck in line on something, meditate in your head, pray, utilize the faculties that are available to us, but understanding the spiritual concepts, because we are mind, body, spirit.
Yes.
And if we can grow in our spiritual dynamic, then everything else will be enhanced because of that. And I think what you're discussing and describing to me is an evolution of the recognition of the importance of spirituality in our everyday lives and how it can help us be tooled to better deal with our challenges with one another, de-escalating the ego.
Yes. And thank you. Thank you. The fact that you're an attorney who gets this and who not only gets it, but actually lives it, practices it. It's like you walk your talk. That gives me hope.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. We are coming to the end of the interview, but I did want to ask you this. If you were to summarize your spiritual journey in one word, what would it be and why?
Wow. I think it would have to be surrender. Like somebody asked me recently, which it's funny that I hadn't thought about it or nobody had asked me before. And they asked me, what is your greatest gift? And after considering that, what I landed on was my capacity to love, like the depth of my love and the depth of my surrender. And that's a whole other conversation. I have a whole chapter about that because we think surrender is like throwing in the white towel and giving up. And it's not. Like, there's huge power in surrender, counterintuitively. And it has to do with stepping out of the ego and stepping into the other realm, like our authentic self, who we really are.
When you say that, it makes me think of if anyone deals with a spiritual relationship, like a twin flame dynamic, and they go through this topsy-turvy dynamic. I've gone through this with someone I met about a year ago. It was a twin flame in my life, and the topsy-turviness of it, and part of the stage is finally to surrender. And when you surrender, you're actually freeing yourself in many ways, and you're enlarging your opportunities of growth and change and transformation. So I can understand what you're describing and relate to it very strongly and appreciate it. I want to thank you for coming on today and sharing your book, Awakening the Soul Power, and sharing these concepts, because I think they're so pivotal, critical, and so timely with all of this. And I think it's very relevant to what we're working through as our society right now and in our world. So I want to thank you for coming on for that. I just want to thank Christian de la Huerta for coming on the show today, sharing his viewpoints and concepts and ideas with his new book, Awakening the Soul Power, How to Live Heroically and Set Yourself Free. This book is a great read. It's an amazing book. Check it out and check out our guest. And I just can't begin to say enough. The website to check out is www.soulfulpower.com. I'll repeat that, www.soulfulpower.com. Awakening the Soul of Power book is also listed on that site when you look at it. And I just want to encourage everyone to check out this book, check out Soulful Hero Media that published this book, and keep an open mind when you read these concepts, because if it's something that's new to you, learn from it. There's a lot of lessons you can learn from reading this book, and not just about our own personal individual experiences, but about our individual journeys within ourselves and within society. I can't speak enough about how good of a book this is, how good of a read, and the concepts are very intrinsic in spirituality. So if you're new to spirituality, check out this book. You will be enlightened and you'll be happy you did so. Thank you for checking out our episode today. I'll leave this. When we were talking with Christian earlier and we were discussing about freeing ourselves, I thought back to a song when I was younger. Since we had Gloria Estefan on the early part of the conversation, I'm not going to quote her, but I will say, free your mind and the rest will follow. That's an allusion to In Vogue. And I thought that song popped in my head because I'm thinking of freeing ourselves from the burdens of the past and the constructs of our mind that we need to get through in our ego to get past where we need to go and evolve. So with that said, thank you for tuning in. We're going to have plenty of more amazing episodes coming back, and I look forward to the next time. Stay positive, because when you're positive, anything's possible.